The morning I got fired, I was the one who'd written the termination policy. I don't mean I was familiar with it. I mean I'd drafted it, revised it, run it through legal review, trained every manager on it, and built the entire disciplinary framework that made it function. And on a Tuesday in March, my older brother sat across from me in the conference room I'd furnished myself, slid a single sheet of paper across the table, and used my own language against me. Termination of employment, effective immediately, he said. Ongoing pattern of insubordination and attitude issues incompatible with company culture. I stared at the form. My name was typed in the employee line. The signature at the bottom belonged to my brother, Neil. The witness signature belonged to our cousin, Darren, who wouldn't look at me. And the HR representative line, the line that was supposed to be mine, had been signed by a woman I'd never met. Her name was Gretchen Moss. Underneath it, in freshly printed text, was her new title, Interim Director of Human Resources. My title, my department, my entire career sitting in the hands of a stranger inside a company that had my last name on the building. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be erased from something you built with your own hands, stay with me. Because what I found out after that meeting changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Renata Scofield. I'm 36. And for 11 years, I was the head of human resources at Scofield Mechanical, a mid-size industrial supply company in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We distributed valves, fittings, pumps, and pressure equipment to manufacturers across the Midwest. Not glamorous, not exciting to explain at parties. But it was real work with real employees, and it paid real bills for about 140 people. My father, Vince Scofield, started the company in 1987 with a warehouse, a used forklift, and a catalogue he photocopied at the library. By the time I graduated college, Scofield Mechanical was doing around $19 million a year in revenue. Tight margins distribution always is, but steady, reliable. The kind of business that doesn't make anyone rich overnight, but keeps a family comfortable across generations. Dad had 3 kids. Neil, the oldest, who was 41 when all this happened. Me in the middle. And our younger sister, Cass, who was 32, lived in Kalamazoo and had nothing to do with the company. She taught 4th grade and kept her distance from family business on purpose. I used to think that was cowardly. Now I think she might have been the smartest one of all of us. I started working at Scofield Mechanical the summer after I finished my MBA. I'd focused on organizational behavior and human resource management, and Dad was thrilled. Neil had been in operations for 3 years already, learning the warehouse, the logistics, the vendor relationships. Dad's plan was simple. Neil runs the business side, Renata runs the people side, and together they keep the company healthy for the next generation. For the first 5 or 6 years, that's more or less what happened. I built the HR department from nothing. When I arrived, employee records were kept in a filing cabinet in the break room. There was no onboarding process, no performance review system, no documented disciplinary procedure. We had 40 employees and no employee handbook. I wrote one. I created a benefits comparison process that saved the company $11,000 the first year. I implemented a safety training program that reduced our workers' comp claims by nearly a third. I hired every single person who joined the company after 2014, and I handled every separation, every dispute, every leave request, every accommodation. HR was not a side function at Scofield Mechanical. It was the infrastructure that made everything else work. And I was the only person who understood all of it, because I'd designed all of it. Neil ran operations, and he was decent at it. Not visionary, but competent. He kept the trucks running, maintained vendor relationships, managed the warehouse supervisors. Where we diverged was temperament. Neil believed management meant control. I believed it meant clarity. He wanted loyalty. I wanted documentation. He ran his side like a foreman. I ran mine like a system. For years, that tension was manageable. Dad was still involved, still the majority owner, still the person who made final calls. He held 60% of the company. Neil held 25. I held 15. Those were the shares Dad had distributed when he semi-retired in 2019. He kept his 60% and his title, but the day-to-day authority shifted mostly to Neil as general manager. I reported to Neil on paper. In practice, I reported to the work. The first real crack appeared about 2.5 years before I was fired. Neil hired a new operations manager named Dale Kessler without posting the position, without running it through me, and without conducting a background check. I found out when Dale showed up on a Monday morning and Neil introduced him to the warehouse team. I pulled Neil aside that afternoon. "You can't hire someone without going through HR," I said. "That's not a suggestion. That's the process we agreed on. That's the process Dad approved." Neil smiled the way he always did when he thought I was being rigid. "Dale's a friend. I've known him 15 years. He doesn't need a background check." "Everyone needs a background check. That's the policy." "Renata, relax. I'm the GM. I made a judgment call." I went to Dad. Dad told me to let it go, that Neil was learning to lead, and sometimes leaders had to make fast decisions. I documented the conversation in my own files, ran a retroactive background check on Dale, which came back clean and moved on. But that was the first time Neil bypassed me completely. It wasn't the last. Over the next 2 years, it happened again and again in small ways. He approved overtime without documenting it. He moved an employee between departments without updating their file. He gave a verbal warning to a warehouse worker and never reported it. He signed off on a raise for his assistant without going through the compensation review I'd built. Each time, I flagged it. Each time, he told me I was overthinking it. Each time, Dad either sided with Neil or told me to pick my battles. And each time, I noticed something subtle. After I pushed back on one of Neil's decisions, the atmosphere around me would change. Not dramatically, just enough. A meeting I should have been invited to would happen without me. An email chain would start without my name on it. Neil would make a comment to someone, not to me directly, about how HR makes everything harder than it needs to be. I started hearing the word attitude in late 2023. Not from Neil himself at first, from Darren, our cousin, who worked in accounting and had always been more aligned with Neil than with me. Darren mentioned it casually one afternoon when we were both getting coffee. "Neil says you've had kind of an attitude lately," he said, not looking up from his phone. "An attitude about what?" "I don't know. Just pushback. On everything." "That's literally my job, Darren." He shrugged. "I'm just telling you what I heard." I let that go too. I shouldn't have. In January of the year I was fired, something happened that I believe set everything in motion. Dad had a mild heart episode. Not a full heart attack, but enough to land him in the hospital for 2 days and scare all of us. He was 68 and had been talking about fully retiring for over a year. After the hospital stay, he made it official. He told Neil and me, separately, that he intended to transfer his remaining shares and step away from any operational role by the end of that year. The question nobody asked out loud was obvious: who gets the shares? Dad didn't say, not immediately, but I noticed that in the weeks after his announcement, Neil became significantly more attentive to Dad. He visited the house more. He brought lunch to Mum. He volunteered to drive Dad to cardiology appointments. I don't want to say it was entirely calculated Neil loved Dad, but there was an energy to it that felt performative, like he was campaigning. Meanwhile, I was managing a real crisis at work. One of our warehouse supervisors, a man named Terence, had filed an internal complaint about a coworker using racial slurs on the floor. I was conducting interviews, documenting everything, coordinating with our outside employment counsel. It was exactly the kind of situation that justified having a real HR department, and I was handling it carefully because I knew a misstep could expose the company to liability. Neil wanted it to go away fast. He called me into his office and told me to wrap it up. Wrap what up? I said. I'm in the middle of an investigation. The guy who said it has been here 9 years. Terence has been here 14 months. I'm not losing a senior guy over a he-said situation. It's not a he-said situation. 2 other employees confirmed it. Then give him a written warning and move on. Neil, that's not how this works. If we don't handle it properly and Terence goes to the EEOC, we're looking at a real problem. He leaned back in his chair. You know what your problem is, Renata. You treat this place like it's a courtroom. It's a family business. People talk to each other. People work things out. You don't need to turn every disagreement into a federal case. I'm not turning it into anything. I'm following the procedure that I wrote and that Dad approved. Dad's not running things anymore. That sentence sat in the air between us for a long time. I completed the investigation properly. The employee who'd made the slurs received a final written warning with a corrective action plan, and I documented everything. Terence stayed. The senior employee was angry, and Neil was angrier. He stopped speaking to me for almost 2 weeks after that. When he did start again, it was clipped, transactional, cold. Then came the meeting with Darren. I didn't know about it until after the fact. In late February, Neil and Darren met with Dad at the house. Mum was there. I was not invited. I found out from Cass, who'd heard about it from Mum during a phone call. They talked about the company, Cass told me, about what happens when Dad transfers his shares. And nobody thought to include me? Mom said Neil told Dad it would be easier to talk without tension. Tension meaning me. Cass was quiet for a moment. Renata, I think they're planning something. I wanted to dismiss that. Cass was dramatic sometimes. She saw conflict where there was just disorganization. But something about the way she said it made the hair on my arms stand up. I called Dad the next day. He sounded tired, which was normal now. I asked about the meeting. He said it was nothing, just Neil going over some operational stuff. Dad, if you're making decisions about the shares, I need to be part of that conversation. Nobody's making decisions yet, Renata. Calm down. Calm down. That phrase had followed me my whole life. Every time I raised a concern that made someone uncomfortable, the response was never to address the concern. It was to address my tone. 2 weeks later, I was fired. The termination meeting lasted 11 minutes. Neil, Darren, and Gretchen Moss, who I later learned was a freelance HR consultant. Neil had quietly retained 3 weeks earlier. She'd been brought in, he said, to provide independent oversight of personnel matters. She had no employment history with us, no knowledge of our policies, no understanding of our workforce. She was there to make the paperwork look legitimate. The stated reason was attitude. The termination letter cited 3 incidents. First, my confrontational response to Neil's hiring of Dale Kessler 2.5 years earlier. Second, my refusal to follow management direction during the Terence investigation. Third, a pattern of hostile and dismissive communication that created a toxic environment for leadership. I read each line slowly. I recognized the language. It was modeled on my own template. Someone had taken the termination form I'd created, the disciplinary framework I'd built, and used it to remove me. This is wrong, I said. You know this is wrong. Neil folded his hands on the table. This isn't personal, Renata. This is a business decision. A business decision. You're firing your sister from the company she helped build, and you're calling it a business decision. The decision has been made. Gretchen will handle the transition. I looked at Darren. He was staring at the table. I looked at Gretchen, who had the practiced blank expression of someone who knew she was being used, but had decided not to care. I want to talk to Dad, I said. Dad supports this decision, Neil said. I didn't believe him, but I also didn't have the strength to fight it in that room, in that moment, with those people looking at me like I was a problem being solved. I took the letter. I walked out of the building. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 45 minutes without starting the engine. The first person I called was my husband, Marco. We'd been married 4 years. He worked as a project manager for a construction firm and had always been patient about my family's complications. When I told him what happened, there was a long pause. They actually did it, he said. You knew? I didn't know, but I'm not surprised. The way Neil's been acting the last few months. Renata, he's been building to this. Marco came home early that day. We sat at the kitchen table, and I laid it all out. The years of being bypassed, the growing hostility, the meeting I wasn't invited to, and now this. Marco listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved about him. When I finished, he asked one question. What do you want to do? I didn't know yet, but I knew I needed to talk to Dad directly without Neil filtering the conversation. I drove to my parents' house the next morning. Mum answered the door and hugged me, but there was something stiff about it. She led me to the living room where Dad was sitting in his recliner, watching the weather. Dad, I need to talk to you about what happened yesterday. He muted the television. Neil told me. Did Neil tell you he made up the reasons? Did he tell you the incidents he cited were me doing my job correctly? Dad rubbed his face. He looked older than 68. Renata, I know you're upset, but Neil is the general manager. He has to be able to make staffing decisions. Staffing decisions. I'm not staff, Dad. I'm your daughter. I own 15% of this company. And that's a separate issue. It's not separate. He's removing me from the company so he can control the share transfer. Can you not see that? Mum came in from the kitchen. Renata, your father just got out of the hospital 2 months ago. Can we please not do this right now? I looked at her. I loved my mother, but she had spent her entire marriage smoothing things over. Conflict didn't get resolved in our family. It got buried under casseroles and changed subjects. Mom, I'm not trying to stress Dad out. I'm trying to understand why my brother just fired me using a policy I wrote for doing the job I was hired to do. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, maybe some time away from each other will help. You and Neil have been butting heads for years. Maybe this is a chance to reset. A chance to reset. He was framing my termination as a cooling-off period, as though I'd been sent to my room. I left my parents' house, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not just anger, grief. Deep, disorienting grief. Because I realized that Dad wasn't going to fight for me. Not because he didn't love me, but because fighting for me would mean confronting Neil. And confronting Neil would mean disrupting the thing Dad cared about more than any of us, the company's stability. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 a.m, I got up and went to my home office. I had copies of every significant HR document I'd created for Scofield Mechanical. Not company files, I hadn't taken proprietary data. But over the years, I'd kept personal copies of the policies I'd authored, the templates I'd designed, the training materials I'd written. I also had my own notes from every time Neil had bypassed a procedure. Dates, descriptions, outcomes. I pulled a folder from my bottom drawer. Inside was something I'd almost forgotten about. 2 years earlier, when Neil hired Dale without going through me, I'd been so frustrated that I'd written a detailed memo to Dad outlining every instance of Neil overriding HR protocols. Dad had asked me not to send it. He said he'd talk to Neil privately. I'd agreed, and I'd filed the memo away. Now I read it again. 14 documented instances of Neil bypassing established procedure, each one with a date, a description, and the policy it violated. And at the bottom, a line I'd written that now felt prophetic. If these patterns continue unchecked, the company faces increasing exposure to legal liability, and the HR function will be unable to protect the organization. I'd predicted this, not the firing, but the erosion, and I'd been told to put it away. The next morning, I called a friend from my MBA program, Janelle, who practiced employment law in Detroit. I wasn't sure I had a case, and I told her that up front. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. When I finished, Janelle was quiet for a few seconds. "Here's what I think is happening," she said. "Your brother doesn't just want you out of the building. He wants you out of the conversation about those shares. As long as you're working there, you have visibility into the operation, you have institutional knowledge, and you have relationships with the employees. You're a threat to his control. Firing you removes all of that." "But I still own 15%. "You do, and that's exactly why this matters. A minority shareholder who's also an active employee has influence. A minority shareholder who's been terminated for cause and characterized as difficult. That person gets marginalized. When it comes time to negotiate the share transfer, Neil can point to your termination and argue that your involvement was damaging to the company." My stomach dropped. He's building a narrative. That's what it looks like. Janelle recommended I consult with a business attorney who handled shareholder disputes. She gave me a name, Patricia Yoon, in Grand Rapids. I called that afternoon. Patricia was direct and practical. She told me that being a minority shareholder in a family company was one of the most vulnerable positions in business law. Majority shareholders and management could make my life very difficult. They could freeze me out of decisions, withhold distributions, dilute my interest, or pressure me to sell at a discount. The termination, she said, might be the first step in exactly that process. "What can I do?" I asked. "First, we send a formal letter preserving your rights as a shareholder. You're entitled to financial records, meeting notices, and information about major business decisions. Second, we put them on notice that the termination may give rise to claims wrongful termination, breach of fiduciary duty, minority shareholder oppression. We don't have to file anything yet, but we make it clear that you're not going to disappear quietly." "Will that actually stop anything?" "It'll slow things down, and it'll make your father's attorney, whoever's handling the share transfer, pay attention to the fact that this isn't a clean situation." Patricia sent the letter within a week. Neil's response came through the company's outside counsel 4 days later. It was brief and dismissive. It stated that my termination was a lawful employment decision, that my shareholder rights were unaffected, and that no further response was necessary. But something else happened that same week that changed everything. Terence called me, the warehouse supervisor whose complaint I'd investigated. He'd gotten my personal number from another employee. "Ms. Scofield, I don't know if you know this," he said, "but they're trying to undo everything you did." "What do you mean?" "That woman, Gretchen, came and talked to me yesterday. She said the company was reviewing my complaint and that they might reclassify it as a mutual interpersonal conflict instead of a harassment finding. She asked me to sign something. Did you sign it? No. It didn't feel right. That's why I'm calling you. My hands were shaking. Neil wasn't just removing me. He was dismantling my work. If Terence's complaint was reclassified, the documentation I'd created would be undermined. The corrective action against the senior employee could be reversed. And if Terence later went to the EEOC, the company's defense, the defense I had carefully built, would have a hole in it. Neil was weakening the company to consolidate his control, and he probably didn't even understand the risk. I told Terence not to sign anything without consulting an attorney. I gave him Janelle's name. Then I called Patricia and told her what I'd learned. This is significant, Patricia said. It suggests that your termination wasn't just about removing you from a role. It was about removing the person who would object to what they wanted to do next. Over the following weeks, I requested formal access to the company's financial records as a shareholder. Neil delayed. I requested again through Patricia. He delayed further. After the third request, Patricia filed a motion compelling disclosure. It took almost 6 weeks, but eventually a partial set of records arrived. Marco and I spread the documents across our dining room table on a Saturday afternoon. I'm not an accountant, but 11 years in that company had taught me to read a P&L statement and follow the money. What I found wasn't dramatic fraud. It was something quieter and, in a way, worse. Over the preceding 18 months, Neil had approved a series of consulting payments to a firm called Bridgepoint Advisory Group. The total was just under $90,000. There was no corresponding contract in the records provided, no scope of work, no deliverables. The payments were categorized as operational consulting. I didn't recognize the firm. I looked it up. Bridgepoint Advisory Group was registered to a residential address in Wyoming, Michigan, about 15 minutes from our warehouse. The registered agent was Dale Kessler's wife. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Neil had hired his friend Dale without a background check. Dale's wife had a consulting firm, and that firm had received $90,000 from the company for services that weren't documented. I couldn't prove that the money went directly into Neil's pocket, but the connection was undeniable, and the lack of documentation was damning. "This is why he didn't want you looking at anything," Marco said quietly. "This is why he needed you gone." I brought the information to Patricia. She was careful to frame it correctly. "We can't prove theft based on what we have," she said, "but we can demonstrate a pattern of self-dealing, lack of oversight, and breach of fiduciary duty. Combined with the wrongful termination and the attempt to reclassify Terence's complaint, we have a very strong picture of mismanagement." "What does that mean practically?" "It means when your father's attorney starts working on the share transfer, this information will be relevant. It means Neil can't quietly push you out and claim it was about attitude. And it means that if we need to, we can petition for a judicial review of the company's management." I didn't want to destroy the company. I need to be clear about that. Despite everything, Scofield Mechanical employed 140 people. Those people had mortgages and kids and health insurance. My father had built something real, and I didn't want to burn it down to prove a point. But I also wasn't going to let Neil rewrite reality. I called Cass. I needed someone in the family who wasn't entangled in the business. She listened to everything: the termination, the Bridgepoint payments, the Terence situation, the share transfer. "Renata," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "A couple of weeks ago, Neil called me. He said he wanted to talk about Dad's retirement plan, but then he started talking about you. He said you'd been impossible to work with for years, that you'd made the office miserable, that firing you was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was for the good of the company." And you believed him? I didn't know what to believe. You and Neil have always fought. I figured the truth was somewhere in the middle. That hurt more than the firing had. My own sister thought the truth was somewhere in the middle between me doing my job and me being terminated for it. Cass, he's been paying $90,000 to his friend's wife's consulting firm. There's no contract, no work product, nothing. She was quiet. That's why he fired me, I said. Not because of my attitude, because I was the only person in that building who would have caught it. When she spoke again, her voice was different. What do you need me to do? I need you to talk to Dad. Without Neil. Without Mom managing the conversation. Just you and Dad. Tell him what I told you. He needs to hear it from someone he doesn't think has an agenda. Cass agreed. It took her a week to find the right moment. She drove to Grand Rapids on a Sunday when Mum was at church. The conversation didn't go the way either of us hoped. Cass told me afterward that Dad listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss it. But when she finished, he said something that cracked something inside me. Your sister always had to be right, he said, even when being right made everything harder. He didn't deny the Bridgepoint payments. He didn't defend them. He simply redirected the conversation to my personality, as though the real problem with discovering financial irregularities was that I was the kind of person who noticed them. I cried that night in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Not angry tears. The deep, exhausting kind that come from realizing that someone you love has chosen comfort over you. Marco held me and didn't say anything. Later, when I'd stopped, he said, "You don't need his permission to protect yourself." He was right. I'd spent my entire adult life building systems to protect other people. I'd written the policies, created the procedures, trained the managers. I'd protected the company from itself 100 times. But I'd never once built a system to protect myself. Because I thought the family was the system. I thought loyalty was mutual. Two things happened in close succession that forced the situation forward. First, Terence filed a formal complaint with the EEOC. He'd consulted with Janelle, and when Gretchen continued pressuring him to reclassify his complaint, he decided he'd had enough. The EEOC complaint named Scofield Mechanical and specifically referenced the change in HR leadership as a factor in the hostile work environment. Second, Dad's attorney, a semi-retired lawyer named Frank Bowen, who'd handled the family's business affairs for decades, contacted Patricia to discuss the share transfer. Frank wanted to schedule a meeting with all shareholders. Patricia agreed, on the condition that the Bridgepoint payments and my termination be included on the agenda. Frank pushed back initially. Then Patricia sent him the documentation. She told me later that Frank called her within an hour of receiving it. He wasn't happy, she said. Not at you, at the situation. I think he realized he was about to facilitate a share transfer in a company with undisclosed related party transactions and pending federal complaints. His malpractice insurance wasn't going to like that. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Frank Bowen's office in downtown Grand Rapids. Dad would be there. Neil would be there. I would be there. Darren was invited as a company representative. Cass was invited as a family member, though she held no shares. I barely slept the night before. Marco offered to come, but I told him this was something I needed to do in the room, with my family, face to face. When I walked into Frank's conference room, Neil was already seated. He looked composed, confident. Dad was next to him, looking small in a way that had nothing to do with the chair. Darren was in the corner, doing that thing he always did, where he pretended to review his phone so he didn't have to make eye contact. Cass sat near the window, arms crossed. Frank opened by stating that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss the transfer of Vincent Scofield's 60% ownership stake and to address related matters that have come to the firm's attention. Neil immediately tried to narrow the scope. This is a share transfer meeting, Frank. My sister's employment issues aren't relevant. They are if they affect the valuation and governance of the company, Patricia said calmly. Protection I'd ever thought to build. And the one thing I'd never written into any of them, a provision for what happens when the person you're protecting the company from is the person who runs it. I wrote that provision the next morning. It's in there now. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're the person who always gets told they have an attitude for doing their job correctly, trust yourself. The people who punish you for having standards are usually the ones who can't survive them.